I knew something had already been decided before anyone said it out loud. It was in the way my father held his glass a little higher than usual, like he was about to mark a moment. My brother Caleb sat across from me, shoulders squared, not quite smiling, but close to it. My mother kept adjusting the napkin in her lap, not looking at either of us directly. The air conditioner hummed steadily, filling the silence that came before the announcement. Then my father cleared his throat. "We're helping Caleb with a down payment," he said. $85,000. He said it simply, like it didn't need discussion. No one looked at me. Not at first. I kept my hands folded on the table, waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part where he would include me in the same way. But nothing followed. My mother nodded once, as if confirming something that had already been agreed on long before this dinner. I glanced at Caleb. He avoided my eyes, focusing instead on his glass, like there was something delicate about the moment that might break if he looked up. So I asked the only thing that made sense. "What about me?" My father finally turned toward me. There was no hesitation in his expression, no uncertainty, just a kind of quiet certainty that made the answer feel prepared. Why would we invest in failure? The words landed without force, but they stayed there. I didn't respond right away. I noticed the edge of my plate, the small scratch along the rim that I hadn't seen before. The hum of the air conditioner didn't change. Nothing in the room shifted except the way I understood it. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain myself. There wasn't anything in his tone that suggested he was asking for a different perspective. "My name is Penelope Whitaker. I am 36 years old." I sat there for a few seconds longer, just long enough to be sure I had heard him correctly. And then I stood up. No one stopped me as I walked out. What stayed with me wasn't the insult itself, but how natural it sounded to him, as if it fit into something that had already been decided long ago. I didn't drive far that night before I understood the dinner hadn't created anything new. It had just made something visible that had been there for years. Caleb had always moved through life with a kind of quiet backing that I didn't question at the time because it was explained in ways that sounded reasonable. When he got into business school, my parents covered part of his tuition without much discussion. My father called it supporting potential, and my mother handled the payments like it was part of a plan they had already agreed on. He didn't talk about success as something you built slowly, only as something that should already look complete from the outside. Later, when Caleb took an internship in Dallas, they paid his rent for several months. I remember my father telling me it would help him focus, that it was important he didn't get distracted by things that could slow him down. At the time, I nodded along, because it made sense if you believed in what he was building. When I chose construction, the tone shifted in ways that were harder to name at first. There wasn't a refusal, exactly, just an absence of involvement. I paid for my certification on my own, worked extra jobs to cover the cost, and bought my first set of tools from a man who was closing down his small shop. Some of them didn't match, and a few needed repair, but they worked. I remember showing them to my mother one afternoon, laying them out on the table like they might mean something to her. She looked them over, smiled in a polite way, and said, "Your work is fine, Penelope, but it's not something permanent." She had always believed stability came from things people could recognize without explanation. Titles, offices, roles that didn't need to be defended. She didn't say it to hurt me. That was what made it harder to argue with. I told myself she just didn't understand what I was trying to build. That once I had something more stable, something they could recognize, their view would shift on its own. I kept working with that idea in the back of my mind, adjusting myself in small ways I didn't always notice. Looking back, I can see how I kept waiting for a change that wasn't coming, and how each of those moments, taken on their own, seemed small enough to ignore until they weren't anymore. I didn't go back inside after I stepped out of that house. The door closed behind me without anyone calling my name, and for a moment I stood there, letting the quiet settle in a way it hadn't inside. The night air felt cooler than I expected, but it wasn't enough to pull me out of what had just happened. I walked to my car, started the engine, and sat there longer than I needed to. My phone lit up once on the passenger seat, then again, but I didn't pick it up. I already knew what the messages would say, or at least the direction they would take. There would be explanations, maybe a suggestion that I had misunderstood something, or that I was taking it too personally. I turned the phone face down and drove home. When I got there, Daniel was still up, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers he hadn't finished going through. He looked up when I walked in, reading my face before I said anything. "What happened?" he asked. "They gave Caleb $85,000 for a house," I said, setting my keys down. I paused just long enough to decide whether the next part mattered, and when I asked about me, my dad called me a failure. Daniel didn't respond right away. He leaned back slightly, like he was making space for the weight of it. "Are you going to talk to them?" he asked. I shook my head once. No, it wasn't a decision I had to think through in pieces. It was already there, settled in a way that felt complete. That night, I blocked my parents' numbers. I didn't draft a message or explain myself. I just removed the line that had always been open. It wasn't anger that guided that choice. It was recognition, quiet and steady, that nothing on the other side of that line was going to change. The morning after I cut contact, nothing around me looked different. But I noticed how much of my attention had been tied up in something that no longer existed. By then, I had been working as a contractor for 8 years. It wasn't a large operation, and I didn't present it that way to anyone. But it was steady. Most of my work came from people who had already seen what I could do, or from referrals that came without me asking. I didn't have to convince anyone of anything once I was on a job. Daniel had taken on more of the structure over time, handling scheduling and keeping track of payments when things overlapped. He wasn't in the field with me, but he understood how the business moved, and that made it easier to keep everything consistent. We weren't building something fast, but we weren't falling behind either. There was money set aside, but enough to give us options if we made careful decisions. There were weeks where the work slowed more than I expected, and I caught myself checking the numbers more often than I wanted to admit. I hadn't been waiting for my parents to step in. That part only became clear after they refused. What changed after that dinner wasn't what I had. It was how I looked at it. I stopped comparing it to something else, something that had never really included me in the first place. For the first time, what I had built felt complete on its own, without needing to be measured against anything outside of it. I didn't hear about Caleb's house directly from him. By then, we weren't speaking, and the space between us stayed that way without much effort. The details came through an aunt who mentioned it casually, like it was something I should already know. He had bought a place in one of the newer developments on the north side of Austin, the kind of neighborhood where everything looked finished at the same time. The houses were larger than they needed to be, with clean driveways and small trees planted in straight lines along the sidewalks. It was the kind of place my parents had always pointed to when they talked about what a stable life should look like. The $85,000 had gone toward the down payment. It made the purchase possible, but it didn't make it easy. From what I understood, the monthly payments were higher than what Caleb had been used to handling. The mortgage itself was only part of it. There were property taxes that increased faster than expected, maintenance costs that didn't wait for better timing, and the quiet pressure of keeping everything in a condition that matched the neighborhood. My parents didn't treat any of that as a concern. They visited often in the first few months, walking through the house with a kind of satisfaction that didn't leave room for hesitation. "This is what success looks like," my father told him more than once. That sentence stayed with me, not because I agreed with it, but because I recognized what it required from him. I heard later, again through someone else, that Caleb had hesitated before signing the final papers. He had gone over the numbers more than once, trying to make them settle into something manageable. There was a point where he could have stepped back. He didn't. I can understand that now in a way I couldn't have then. Saying no to that kind of help doesn't just change a decision. It changes how you're seen by the people offering it. So he said yes, even if the numbers didn't quite hold, and built something around that choice that needed to be maintained whether it fit him or not. At the time, I didn't follow it closely. I had already shifted my focus elsewhere, and what was happening in his life didn't feel connected to mine anymore in a way that required attention. He called me once, late in the evening, after I had already stopped expecting anything from him. "I thought I could make it work," he said. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit between us longer than it needed to. "Did you?" I asked. There was a pause long enough to feel deliberate. "No," he said. I thought they were right. The shift didn't happen all at once, and it didn't come with any kind of clear turning point at the beginning. It was more about what I stopped doing than what I started. After I cut contact with my parents, I noticed how much space had opened up in my head. I wasn't running conversations back, wasn't trying to measure myself against something I didn't control. That space went somewhere, and most of it went into work. About 6 months later, a client I had worked with before called and asked if I could take on a larger project. It involved a full interior rebuild, the kind of job I had usually passed on because it required more coordination than I had been comfortable managing alone. I told him I'd look at it, but when I walked through the site, I already knew it was bigger than anything I had handled up to that point. For a day or two, I considered turning it down. It would have been the safer choice. Instead, I said yes. The problem showed up quickly. I didn't have enough people to keep the work moving at the pace the contract required. The first week stretched thin, and by the second, I could see where things would start slipping if I didn't adjust. By the end of the second week, the client called me directly. His tone wasn't angry, just controlled. If I couldn't catch up within 5 days, he would pull the contract and bring someone else in. Daniel looked over the schedule with me one night at the kitchen table, running through the numbers in a way that made the gap clear. "You either bring people in, or you lose the job," he said. Not pushing, just stating it. Hiring a crew meant taking on more risk than I had before. It meant trusting people I hadn't worked with long enough to predict. For a moment, I thought about scaling the project back, but that would have cost me the contract entirely. So I hired a small team and stayed closer to the work than I ever had. Managing details I would have handed off in smaller jobs. It wasn't smooth. There were delays, and I made mistakes in how I assigned things at first, but we corrected them as we went. We finished on time, but not cleanly. I lost money on that project because I had priced it like something smaller, something safer. I remember sitting at the table that night, going over the numbers twice, not because I didn't understand them, but because I wanted them to look different. That project led to another, and then another. Not all at once, but consistently enough that I could see the pattern forming. It wasn't sudden growth. It was something steadier, something that held. I realized later that I wouldn't have taken that kind of risk before. I had been too focused on avoiding failure, and that had kept me from stepping into work that required more from me. About a year after things began to shift in my work, Daniel and I started looking for land. We didn't look at anything close to the city center because the prices didn't make sense for what we needed. Instead, we drove out past the edges of Austin, where the roads stretched longer and the lots weren't already shaped into something finished. The piece we found wasn't impressive at first glance. The ground was uneven, and there was no structure on it, just open space and a narrow access road that needed work. But it was affordable, and more importantly, it was something we could build on without rushing. We bought it with what we had saved, knowing it meant we would have to take everything else step by step. I didn't stop working for clients when we started building. Most days, I split my time, finishing paid jobs first and then driving out to the land to work on our place until there wasn't enough light left to see clearly. It slowed things down, but it kept us from stretching beyond what we could handle. The house came together in stages. The foundation took longer than expected because I insisted on getting it right the first time. The framing moved faster once I had help from a few people I trusted, the same crew I had started working with after that larger project. We weren't trying to make it look like anything it wasn't. We built what we needed, and we built it to last. We added a small workshop near the back of the property once the main structure was secure. It wasn't large, but it was enough to store materials, organize tools, and handle smaller jobs without moving everything between sites. At some point, I put up a simple sign with the business name near the entrance. It wasn't for show. It just made things easier for deliveries and for clients who needed to find the place. By the time the house was finished, there were usually 1 or 2 trucks parked out front during the day. Depending on what we were working on, it didn't happen all at once. It built up slowly, in pieces that held together because they were done carefully. I wasn't there when Caleb saw the property for the first time, but I know exactly how it must have looked from the road because I had driven that same stretch enough times to understand what stands out and what doesn't. It was a weekday afternoon, and we had 2 trucks parked near the entrance while we were finishing a smaller job out of the workshop. The sign with the business name was set just off the road. Nothing large, but clear enough that you couldn't miss it if you slowed down. Caleb hadn't meant to be there. He had taken a different route to avoid traffic, something small and practical, the kind of decision you don't think about twice. He told me later that he recognized the truck first. It wasn't new, but it was consistent, the same one I had been using for years. Then he saw the house behind it, finished in a way that didn't draw attention to itself but held its shape, solid and complete. He pulled over. From where he stood, he could see the workshop off to the side, the door open, tools organized, materials stacked in a way that showed they were being used, not stored. There were people moving in and out, not many, but enough to make it clear this wasn't something temporary. Everything he had been told about me didn't fit with what was in front of him. What he saw wasn't just a house. It was something that held together. Trucks moving in and out, people who stayed, work that didn't pause. It wasn't larger than what he had bought, but it was something he couldn't walk away from without losing it. He called our father from the side of the road. "You need to see this," he said. I can imagine the pause on the other end, not because my father didn't understand the words, but because he would have needed a moment to decide what they meant. Whatever version of me they had been holding on to didn't leave room for what Caleb was looking at, and once he saw it, he couldn't reduce it to something smaller again. My parents came out a few days after Caleb saw the property. They didn't call ahead with anything that sounded like an apology, just a message saying they were in the area and wanted to stop by. I didn't tell them not to come, but I didn't prepare for them either. They walked the property slowly, taking in the house, the workshop, the trucks parked near the entrance. My father asked a few practical questions about the work, how long things had taken, how many people I had working with me now. My mother commented on how everything looked put together, like she was trying to place it into a category she understood. No one mentioned the dinner. At one point, my father stood near the edge of the driveway and looked back at the house before saying, "We always knew you'd figure something out." He said it calmly, as if it settled something. I let the words sit for a moment, not because I needed time to respond, but because I wanted to be sure I heard them clearly. "No," I said. He didn't respond right away. "You didn't." The air shifted after that, not visibly, but enough that no one tried to correct me. He looked at me then. Not defensive, just slightly thrown off, like the conversation had moved somewhere he hadn't expected. "You believed in something else." I continued, keeping my voice steady. "You believed in who I wasn't willing to be?" My mother looked down, her hands still for once, not adjusting anything, just avoiding where the conversation had settled. There wasn't an argument after that. My mother shifted the conversation back to the house, asking about the layout, the materials, things that didn't require anything from her beyond interest. I understood then that they hadn't come to revisit what had happened. They had come to adjust how they stood in relation to it, without changing anything underneath. Caleb sold the house within the year. The costs had caught up with him in ways that couldn't be managed long-term, and once he stepped out of it, he seemed quieter, more careful in how he talked about what came next. We've spoken a few times since then, not about what happened before, but about work, about small things that don't require us to take positions. My parents still reach out occasionally. I answer when it feels appropriate, but I don't open the door the way it used to be. They aren't part of my daily life. and they won't be part of what comes next. Not the house, not the work, not the family Daniel and I may build. What I built here stayed steady. The house, the work, the routine Daniel and I created together. None of it depended on being seen a certain way.